A Hell's Angel named Rooster was fueling his bike when a small black boy tugged his sleeve. "My uncle makes me sleep in the truck." The boy's jacket fell open, old bruises circling his wrists. Rooster followed him to a sagging house, peered through the fence and saw the truth. He made 2 calls. Within an hour, 6 motorcycles rolled in silent, blocking the uncle's escape. That night, a boy who slept in a truck bed was carried out wrapped in leather, his nightmare ending. That moment outside Baton Rouge would change the course of a child's life and shatter every assumption about a notorious outlaw club. Rooster wasn't looking for a fight that afternoon, and the boy had quit believing anyone would help him. But a single whispered sentence, and one sleeve tugged in a sea of leather, uncovers a story about the kind of justice that comes from the last place anyone expected. Rooster had earned his patch the hard way. 12 years with the Hells Angels, a mechanic who could rebuild a panhead blindfolded, a man whose knuckles told stories he didn't speak. He'd seen every kind of trouble roll through a gas station lot, fights, deals, runaways. But he'd never seen a child that small walk alone through a crowd of bikers. The boy was no older than 7, swimming in a jacket 3 sizes too big, its sleeves hanging past his fingertips. He moved like someone who had learned to make himself invisible, slipping between leather vests and denim without a sound, his eyes fixed on the ground. Later, Rooster would tell his brothers that the kid looked like a ghost, already half gone from the world. The uncle had pulled into that station an hour earlier, driving a rusted pickup that coughed blue smoke. He'd left the boy in the truck bed with a flat pillow and a tattered blanket, told him not to move, not to speak, not to exist. That truck was the boy's bedroom, his school, his prison. Neighbors had whispered for months about the sounds coming from that sagging clapboard house down the gravel road, the shouting, the woman crying, the child who slept outside in every weather. Nobody called. Nobody wanted to get involved. The uncle had a reputation, a mean drunk with a short fuse and a longer memory, so the town looked away. Rooster didn't know any of that yet. He was wiping down his fuel tank when he felt a tiny tug on the frayed cuff of his sleeve. He looked down. The boy's whisper was so thin the wind almost carried it off. "My uncle makes me sleep in the truck." Most men would have dismissed it. A kid complaining about chores, maybe. But Rooster had raised 2 daughters of his own, and he knew the difference between a whine and a wound. He knelt, and the motion caused the boy's oversized jacket to shift. The sleeves rode up. Rooster saw what the jacket had been hiding, a lattice of old bruises circling both wrists, purple and yellow, some fresh, some fatting, the kind that come from being grabbed hard by adult hands over and over again. The boy flinched when Rooster's eyes landed on them. He yanked the sleeves down. Too late. Rooster's jaw tightened. His voice came out softer than anyone who knew him would have believed possible. "Show me where you live." The boy pointed toward a house half a mile down the gravel road, its porch tilting like a broken jaw, its windows curtained with stained bedsheets. Rooster didn't call the police. He didn't call the child services hotline that would take 3 weeks and a stack of paperwork. He made a different call. But first, he followed that boy at a distance, keeping to the tree line, watching through a gap in the fence as an unshaven man staggered onto the porch and began shouting. What Rooster saw in that yard froze the air in his lungs. The rusted pickup sat under a bare tree, its bed holding nothing but a single flattened pillow and a blanket so thin you could read a newspaper through it. This wasn't punishment. This was a child who had been erased, and the man on the porch was about to find out what happens when a Hell's Angel decides that a boy nobody else would see is now under his protection. Rooster didn't wait for the sun to set. He pulled out a burner phone that had exactly 3 saved numbers in its memory. The first number connected before the second ring. A voice like gravel answered. "Rooster, I need you." No questions, no hesitation. That was the club. That was the only family that had ever made sense to a man who'd grown up in 12 different foster homes himself. Rooster gave the address of the sagging clapboard house and told them to come quiet. No engines past the main road. He wanted the uncle to hear nothing but the silence of a trap closing. Then he made the second call, to the one sheriff's deputy in the parish who had once looked the other way when a member's old lady needed a restraining order against a man who wasn't supposed to exist. Deputy Marcus Cole picked up on the fourth ring, sleepy and annoyed, until he heard the tone in Rooster's voice. He'd known Rooster for 5 years, ever since the angel had pulled a burning toddler out of a wreck on the interstate and walked away before the news cameras arrived. "I've got a child, Marcus, a little boy. His uncle's been keeping him in the truck bed, beating him. I saw the marks. I saw where he sleeps." There was a long pause on the line, the kind filled with the sound of a man pulling on his boots and checking his sidearm. "Don't do anything I'll have to arrest you for," the deputy said finally. "Just be there in 20 minutes, knock on the door and ask for the boy's records. I'll have his jacket open before you say a word." Rooster hung up and walked back to the tree line. He didn't take his eyes off the house, not when the shouting inside grew louder, not when the woman's silhouette passed the stained window with a hand pressed to her face. He just stood there, arms crossed, a 240-pound statue in leather, counting the minutes. The bikes arrived before the cruiser. 6 of them rolling down the gravel road with engines cut, boots pushing asphalt, headlights dark. Each man had been hand-picked by Rooster in a group text that read only, "Kid in trouble. No questions. No colors visible. This is personal." They parked in a semicircle just out of sight of the house and walked the last 100 yards through scrub brush and busted fence posts. Among them were a man they called Preacher, who'd spent 10 years as a combat medic and always carried a suture kit next to his pistol, and a giant named Tank who could lift the back end of a Ford but cried every time they rode past an animal shelter. No one spoke. They didn't need to. When Deputy Cole's patrol car turned onto the gravel road with its headlights off, Rooster stepped out of the shadows and raised a hand. The deputy nodded once, and together they approached the porch. The uncle came out before they knocked, as if he'd sensed the weight of men around his house. He was unshaven, barrel-chested, wearing a stained white tank top and a pair of jeans that hadn't seen a washing machine in months. He smelled of sour beer and old violence. The woman stayed inside, but the front window curtain twitched. The uncle's eyes swept across the deputy, then landed on Rooster, then on the 6 leather-clad shapes silently filling his yard like a wall that hadn't been there a moment before. His face did something complicated, fear and fury knotting together. "What the hell is this?" The deputy stepped forward. "Sir, we've received a report concerning a minor child on this property. I need to see the boy, right now." The uncle's mouth opened to argue, but his eyes flicked toward the pickup truck in the yard, toward the pillow and blanket visible through the rusted slats, and something in him deflated just enough to let the deputy pass. He tried to follow, but Tank moved in front of the porch steps without a word, arms crossed, an immovable object. The uncle stumbled back. "You can't be here," he sputtered. Tank said nothing. He just stood there, a 6'6" eclipse blotting out the porch light. Inside the house, the deputy found the boy locked in a back bedroom with no windows. The room was bare except for a mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. The boy was awake, sitting up, eyes wide, as if he'd been waiting for someone to finally open that door. His arms were striped with fresh welts on top of the old bruises. Deputy Cole, a man who had seen dead children before, a man who thought he'd locked his heart behind a badge years ago, had to step back into the hallway for a full 10 seconds before he could lift that boy into his arms and carry him out. When he emerged from the house, the boy clinging to his neck like a baby koala, Rooster was holding the uncle against the peeling siding with one forearm across his throat. The uncle wasn't going anywhere. "You're done," Rooster said, so quietly that only the uncle and Preacher standing right there with a camera phone recording could hear. "You will never touch this child again. You will never see this child again. If you try, I will find you, and it will not be a deputy at your door." The uncle's bladder let go. Nobody helped him clean up. The deputy called in an ambulance, not because the boy was dying, but because he needed a paper trail. At the hospital, a forensic nurse documented 37 distinct injuries in various stages of healing, some only hours old, some months. The boy's ribs had been cracked twice before and never treated. He was severely malnourished. He hadn't spoken a single word since the deputy lifted him from that room. But when Rooster walked into the hospital waiting room, still in his leather vest but with the patches turned inside out so the staff wouldn't panic. The boy's eyes tracked him across the room. And for the first time since the rescue, the child's shoulders dropped. He knew. He knew who had come for him. That night, a family court judge was woken up at home by a call from the sheriff's department. The deputy laid out the evidence, the nurse's preliminary report, the photos of the truck bed. The judge signed an emergency placement order in less than 10 minutes, bypassing the usual bureaucratic crawl. A foster family from 2 parishes over was contacted, a couple who had taken in hard cases before, who had a spare room and a garden and a swing set. At 2 in the morning, Rooster and 3 of his brothers escorted the boy to their door, riding behind the social worker's sedan in formation, engines rumbling low through the sleeping countryside. When the foster mother opened the door, she found a tiny boy in pajamas that were too big, holding the hand of a giant in leather who knelt to whisper 3 words. "You're safe now." But the story didn't end there. The uncle had friends, men who shared his thirst and his grievances. And as the sun rose on the first day of the boy's new life, those men started making phone calls of their own. The town, which had looked away for years, now had its silence exposed, and there were people willing to burn down a lot more than a reputation to keep their secrets buried. The first phone call came at 6 in the morning. A man's voice, slurred and ugly, told Rooster that he'd made a serious mistake and that the uncle had family in the next parish who didn't appreciate outsiders interfering. Rooster listened, said nothing, and hung up. Then he sent a single text to his brothers. "They're threatening. We're not leaving." Within the hour, 4 club members were stationed around the foster family's property, sipping coffee from thermoses, their bikes hidden in the barn. Nobody was getting near that house without being seen. The uncle was charged with felony child abuse and false imprisonment, but he posted bail by noon. Someone with money had stepped in, a cousin who ran a chop shop, or maybe worse. The deputy warned Rooster that the uncle had been heard at a local bar, drunk and raging, promising to take back what's his, and that the boy knew too much. That phrase hung in the air like smoke. The boy knew too much. What could a 7-year-old possibly know that would make a grown man that afraid? That's when the investigation took a turn nobody expected. During a search of the uncle's house, deputies found a locked footlocker under the floorboards. Inside were hundreds of photographs, not just of the boy, but of other children, their faces blank with that same hollowed-out look. Some were decades old. The locker also contained a ledger, names, dates, sums of money, coded notations that made the blood run cold. The uncle wasn't just an abusive caretaker. He was a middleman in a trafficking ring that stretched across 3 states, and the boy had witnessed transactions, had seen faces, had been used as bait. That's why the truck bed was the bedroom. The boy was kept outside so buyers could come and go without seeing the house. The blanket and pillow weren't neglect. They were staging. The FBI was called in. For a week, the quiet parish became a command center. Agents interviewed the boy in a room full of stuffed animals, and slowly, painstakingly, he began to talk. He named names. He described vehicles. He drew a floor plan of a barn where he'd been taken twice. The information led to raids in 4 locations and the arrest of 7 individuals, including a bail bondsman and a school bus driver. The case went from a local rescue to a federal operation overnight, and the town that had looked away now had to confront the monstrous truth that had been operating in plain sight. But the deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous things became for the boy. 2 nights after the raids, someone tried to tamper with the foster family's furnace, leaving a gas line loose. The bikers caught it tank, walking the perimeter, smelled the leak and called the fire department. After that, the club moved the foster family and the boy to a safe house on a member's rural property, a place with a long driveway and clear sightlines in every direction. For 3 weeks, the boy lived among leather and engines, learning to kickstart a dirt bike, eating pancakes shaped like cartoon characters that a 300-pound biker made him every morning. He started laughing again. He started sleeping through the night. The uncle's trial date was set, but he wasn't going quietly. His lawyer painted him as a victim of vigilante bikers who had kidnapped his nephew. Local media, smelling a lurid story, ran headlines about outlaw clubs taking the law into their own hands. Rooster stayed silent, refused interviews, but the deputy stepped forward. He gave a press conference detailing the evidence, the boy's injuries, the photographs in the footlocker. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "Those men you're calling vigilantes are the only reason this child is alive. If they hadn't acted, he'd be dead within the year. Ask yourselves why nobody else saw it." That press conference broke the dam. Neighbors who had known the uncle for years came forward, admitting they'd seen the boy in the truck bed in freezing weather, had heard the screams but hadn't wanted trouble. One woman, crying, told a reporter, "I told myself it wasn't my business. It turned out it was everybody's business." In the comments sections online, the narrative flipped. The bikers were no longer the threat. They were the only adults who had behaved like adults. The trial lasted 11 days. The boy testified via closed-circuit video, his small voice describing years of abuse in simple, devastating detail. The jury was out for 2 hours and returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge gave the maximum sentence, life without parole for the trafficking charges, with additional decades for the abuse. As the bailiff led the uncle away, Rooster was in the gallery, right behind the foster parents, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The uncle turned once and caught his eye. Whatever he saw there made him trip over his own feet. With the trial over, the family court turned to the boy's permanent future. The state wanted to place him in a standard foster-to-adopt pipeline, but the boy's own voice changed everything. He told the judge he wanted to stay with the foster family, the one with the garden, and he wanted the motorcycle men to be his uncles. He drew a picture of a big house with 6 bikes parked outside and a dog he'd named after Rooster. The judge asked the bikers if they were willing to serve as legal guardians in a support capacity, a kind of extended family that the system rarely allowed. Without hesitation, they agreed. 3 months after that dusty afternoon at a gas station outside Baton Rouge, a convoy of Harleys pulled up a long driveway to a foster family's home. The boy ran out, wearing a leather vest cut down to his size, the patches reading "Protected" and "Family." He climbed onto the front of Rooster's bike and twisted the throttle grip, giggling. The truck he once dreaded had been hauled away for scrap, its rusted bed crushed into a cube of forgotten nightmares. As the bikers revved their engines and the boy waved goodbye, it was clear that the hole the world had dug for him was already being filled with something new. The boy they called Little Man, his street name discarded like the stained jacket he'd worn that first afternoon, started first grade the following fall. He walked into the classroom wearing a backpack with a skull-end wings patch sewn onto the flap, a gift from Preacher. The teacher asked about it during show and tell, and the boy stood up in front of 23 other 6-year-olds and said, "That's my family. They're the ones who came when nobody else did." He didn't flinch. The bruises were gone, the cracked ribs knitted smooth, but what had truly healed was the hollowed-out look behind his eyes. He knew now, with a certainty most adults never reach, that he was worth moving heaven and earth for. His adoption was finalized on a sunny Tuesday in April, 14 months after the rescue. The courtroom was packed with leather, 47 Hell's Angels in their full colors, standing silent along the back wall, their beards trimmed and their boots polished. The judge, an old Marine who had presided over 1,000 adoptions, looked at that wall of men and said, "I've seen a lot of families come through these doors. This is the first time I've seen reinforcements." After the gavel fell, Tank lifted the boy onto his shoulders and carried him out into the parking lot where 100 bikes roared to life. The convoy didn't ride to a bar. They rode to an ice cream parlor 3 towns over, and the boy ate a triple scoop cone sitting on the gas tank of Rooster's Dina, laughing so hard he snorted vanilla out his nose. The trafficking ring unraveled completely over the next 2 years. The ledger in the footlocker led FBI agents to 12 more children, some who had been missing for years, stashed in compounds across Louisiana and Mississippi. The uncle, already serving life, was charged federally and placed in solitary confinement after multiple attempts on his life by inmates who'd gotten word of what he'd done. The school bus driver, the bail bondsman, the chop shop cousin, all of them sentenced to decades. The boy's testimony, recorded on video because his voice still shook when he spoke about certain rooms, became a blueprint for how to interview trauma in children. A specialist who worked the case published a paper about it. She dedicated it to R and his angels. But the surprising thing, the detail nobody saw coming, emerged during a deposition for a civil suit the Foster family filed against the state. While reviewing old phone logs, investigators discovered that 3 separate neighbors had called the parish Child Protective Services in the year before the rescue. Each time, a caseworker had driven out, knocked once, left a card, and closed the file due to insufficient evidence. The system had known. 3 times it had known and done nothing. The caseworkers were fired. The parish commissioner resigned. And a law was passed requiring in-person wellness checks for every call involving a child under 10, no exceptions, known informally as Little Man's Law. The bikers didn't celebrate. They just rode to the State House and stood in the gallery while the governor signed it, their patches out and their mouths shut, letting their presence speak. Then came the 2-year anniversary of that dusty afternoon at the gas station. By now, the boy was 9, a wiry kid with a gap-toothed grin who could identify every Harley engine by the sound of its idle. Rooster and the club had remained in his life, not as weekend visitors, but as permanent fixtures. They coached his little league team, taught him to weld, showed him how to break down a carburetor and put it back together blindfolded. His foster parents, now adoptive parents, had long since stopped being surprised when a dozen bikes showed up for Sunday barbecue. The neighbors had stopped calling the cops. On the anniversary, the boy asked Rooster to take him back to the gas station where they'd first met. They rode together, just the two of them, the boy on the back holding tight. When they pulled up to the pump, the same station attendant was there, the same dusty island where a small shadow had once tugged a sleeve. The boy got off the bike, walked over to the exact spot, and stood still for a long moment. Then he turned, looked up at Rooster and said, "This is where I stopped being invisible." Rooster, a man who'd buried more brothers than he could count and never cried at a single funeral, put his sunglasses on and didn't take them off for the whole ride home. The truck, that rusted prison on wheels, had been crushed into a 3-foot cube of scrap metal. The boy's adoptive father had bought it at auction for $1 and parked it in the backyard as a planter. By summer, sunflowers were growing out of the bed where a child once shivered through winter nights. The boy liked to water them. He said they were the tallest things he'd ever seen, and he'd planted them himself. Those sunflowers grew taller than the fence. They grew taller than the boy. They grew taller than the uncle ever stood, and every time the wind pushed through them, the whole backyard filled with a sound like breathing, like something that had been crushed was now climbing toward the light. The boy told his teacher once that the truck bed was the first place he learned to pray, not because he believed anyone was listening, but because the stars were the only ceiling he had. Now he's got a bedroom with a window that opens, a quilt stitched with a crow, and 6 uncles who check in every Sunday like a second heartbeat. The system had 3 chances to see him and closed the file each time. The Hell's Angels needed 1 look. That's the devastating math. We convince ourselves that noticing isn't our job, that someone else will step up, that the whisper of a scared child isn't our problem. But a boy who'd been made invisible was standing right there in the open, at a gas station on a Tuesday, waiting for one person to look down. Rooster looked. And the hardest question I'm left with isn't about them, it's about the rest of us. How many children slip past us every day, tucked in truck beds or locked in back rooms while we find reasons not to see? If a small hand tugged your sleeve tomorrow, would you kneel? Or would you be the 6th door that stays shut? Tell me the truth in the comments, not the answer that makes you look good, the real one. If this story got you, drop a heart down below. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And share this with somebody who needs to remember that quiet, inconvenient courage is still out there. Sometimes wearing a leather vest, sometimes just a faded jacket, but always ready to ride.